Imagine being stripped of everything you've worked for your entire life because you refuse to compromise your principles. Imagine watching from the ground as aircraft you're more qualified to fly than almost anyone else take off without you. Now imagine that one day, when 200 innocent lives hang in the balance, you're the only person who can save them. What would you do? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of March 15, 2019, started like any other for Captain Sarah Mitchell. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her modest apartment in Denver, Colorado, watching the distant contrails streak across the Rocky Mountain sky. For 18 months, this had been her ritual, coffee in hand, watching planes she could no longer pilot disappear into the horizon. At 38 years old, Sarah had accumulated over 12,000 flight hours, including 8,500 on wide-body aircraft. She had been one of the youngest captains ever promoted at Continental Airways, and she held type ratings on 5 different aircraft models. But none of that mattered anymore. Sarah's fall from grace hadn't happened overnight. It began 3 years earlier when she was the captain of Continental Airways Flight 447, a Boeing 777-300ER scheduled to fly from Los Angeles to Tokyo. The aircraft, registration November 77 Alpha Charlie, was one of Continental's newest long-haul jets, equipped with the latest Rolls-Royce Trent 800 engines, and configured to carry 396 passengers across 3 classes. That particular morning, the plane was fully booked with business travelers, families heading to vacation destinations, and crew members repositioning for other flights. The pre-flight inspection had revealed nothing unusual. Sarah and her first officer, Captain James Rodriguez, had completed their standard briefings, reviewed weather patterns over the Pacific, and coordinated with the cabin crew of 14 flight attendants. The load sheet showed they were carrying 285,000 pounds of fuel, enough for the 11-hour journey plus required reserves. Everything appeared routine for what should have been a straightforward trans-Pacific crossing. But 20 minutes before their scheduled departure, Sarah received a call that would change everything. Continental's chief pilot, Michael Harrison, contacted her directly through the aircraft's communication system. The Federal Aviation Administration had issued an emergency directive regarding a potential software glitch in the Boeing 777's flight management computer. The issue could potentially cause the autopilot to disconnect unexpectedly during critical phases of flight, particularly during oceanic crossings, where manual flying skills were essential. The directive was clear. All 777 flights were grounded pending a software update that would take approximately 4 hours to complete. Continental's operations center, however, had different ideas. The airline was already dealing with massive delays from a winter storm that had swept through the Midwest the previous week. Canceling this high-revenue international flight would cost the company nearly $2 million in compensation, rebooking fees, and lost revenue. More importantly, it would strand 396 passengers in Los Angeles, creating a public relations nightmare. Harrison's instructions were explicit: takeoff as scheduled. The software glitch, he argued, was theoretical at best. Continental's maintenance team had run diagnostics on November 7 Alpha Charlie's systems and found no anomalies. The FAA directive was being overly cautious, he claimed, and other airlines were already ignoring it. Sarah's job was to fly the plane, not to interpret federal regulations. Sarah had faced difficult decisions before, but never one with such clear ethical lines. She knew the 777 inside and out. She had been among the first Continental pilots to receive type rating on the aircraft when the airline introduced them to their fleet. She understood that the probability of the software glitch actually manifesting was statistically low. She also understood that her career with Continental Airways hung in the balance. But Sarah also understood something else. Her responsibility as pilot in command superseded any corporate pressure. The FAA directive existed for a reason, written by engineers and safety experts who understood the aircraft's systems far better than airline executives focused on profit margins. The 396 passengers boarding her aircraft trusted her to make decisions based on safety, not financial considerations. The conversation with Harrison grew heated. He reminded Sarah of her contract obligations, her duty to the airline, and the potential consequences of defying direct orders. He mentioned her mortgage, her daughter's college tuition, and the competitive job market for commercial pilots. He also made it clear that other Continental captains were ready and willing to take the flight if she wasn't comfortable with her responsibilities. Sarah's response was measured but firm. She would not compromise passenger safety for corporate convenience. The FAA directive was law, and she would not violate federal regulations regardless of the financial implications for Continental Airways. She requested that the passengers be deplaned and rebooked on alternate flights once the software update was completed. What happened next would become the subject of a 2-year legal battle that would consume Sarah's savings, destroy her reputation within the airline industry, and ultimately end her flying career. Continental Airways accused her of insubordination, breach of contract, and failure to perform her assigned duties. They argued that her refusal to fly constituted abandonment of her post and violated her oath as pilot in command to complete assigned flights safely and efficiently. The airline's legal team painted Sarah as a rogue pilot who prioritized her own interpretation of regulations over the collective expertise of Continental's operations and maintenance departments. They produced evidence that other carriers had continued 777 operations despite the FAA directive, suggesting that Sarah's concerns were unfounded and motivated by personal anxiety rather than legitimate safety considerations. Sarah's defense centered on federal aviation regulations that explicitly granted pilots the authority to refuse any flight they deemed unsafe. Her legal team argued that the pilot-in-command authority superseded airline policies and that Continental's pressure to ignore FAA directives created a hostile work environment that compromised aviation safety. The case dragged through federal court for 18 months. During this time, Continental suspended Sarah without pay and launched an internal investigation that questioned every decision she had made during her 8-year career with the airline. They scrutinized her training records, interviewed former crew members, and analyzed her flight data from hundreds of previous flights. The final verdict was technically a victory for Sarah. The federal judge ruled that Continental had violated federal whistleblower protections and wrongfully terminated her employment. However, the airline industry is small and unforgiving. Word of Sarah's legal battle spread throughout the commercial aviation community, and she found herself effectively blacklisted from major carriers. Airlines viewed her as a liability, a pilot who might prioritize regulations over operational efficiency. Her reputation as someone willing to challenge corporate authority made her unemployable in an industry where following company directives without question was often valued over independent judgment. Job applications were rejected without explanation. Interviews that seemed promising would suddenly go cold. References from former colleagues became increasingly difficult to obtain. Sarah eventually found work as a flight instructor at a small aviation school in Colorado, teaching student pilots the fundamentals of aircraft operation and navigation. The pay was barely 1/10 of her captain's salary at Continental, but it allowed her to remain connected to aviation while supporting her teenage daughter Emma. But the financial pressures were immense. Sarah's legal fees had consumed most of her savings, and her modest instructor salary barely covered basic living expenses. She was forced to sell her home in an upscale Denver suburb and move to a small apartment near the flight school. Emma, who had been planning to attend an expensive private college, instead enrolled in community college to help reduce the family's financial burden. The emotional toll was perhaps even greater than the financial cost. Sarah had defined herself as a pilot since childhood, inspired by stories of aviation pioneers and driven by the technical challenges and responsibilities of commercial flight. Being stripped of that identity left her feeling adrift and questioning whether her principled stand had been worth the personal cost. Yet Sarah never regretted her decision. She knew that airline safety depended on pilots willing to make difficult choices, even when those choices came with severe personal consequences. She had seen too many accidents caused by crews who prioritized schedule adherence over safety protocols, and she refused to become another example of corporate pressure overriding professional judgment. On this particular March morning, as Sarah watched yet another commercial flight disappear into the distance, she had no idea that within hours, her expertise would be desperately needed once again. She had no way of knowing that a crisis was developing that would test everything she had learned about aviation, leadership, and the true meaning of pilot-in-command authority. The phone call that would change everything was still 3 hours away. At exactly 11:47 a.m. Mountain Time, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was familiar. It belonged to Denver International Airport. For a moment, she hesitated. Wrong numbers were common, and she had learned to be cautious about unsolicited calls that might be from reporters still occasionally digging into her legal battle with Continental Airways. "This is Sarah Mitchell," she answered cautiously. "Captain Mitchell, this is Tom Bradley, Air Traffic Control Supervisor at Denver Approach. We have an emergency situation developing, and we need your immediate assistance." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. Air traffic controllers didn't typically contact grounded pilots unless something extraordinary was happening. "What kind of emergency?" United Flight 892, a Boeing 787 Dreamliner inbound from Seattle to Denver, has experienced a dual-engine failure at 28,000 feet over the Colorado Rockies. They're attempting an emergency descent, but we've lost contact with the cockpit crew. The aircraft is still transmitting transponder data, showing they're descending rapidly and are approximately 40 minutes out from D'Ain. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. A dual-engine failure on a commercial airliner was among the most serious emergencies in aviation. While modern twin-engine aircraft like the 787 were designed to fly safely on a single engine, losing both power plants simultaneously was catastrophic. The aircraft would become a glider with limited time to reach a suitable airport. "Tom, I'm not sure how I can help. I'm not current on the 787, and Ma'am, we're aware of your situation with Continental, but right now you're the most experienced heavy aircraft captain within 50 miles of this airport. We've got 184 passengers and 16 crew members on board that aircraft, and Captain David Chen in our control tower specifically requested you." Sarah knew Chen by reputation. He was a former airline pilot who had transitioned to air traffic control after a medical issue ended his flying career. His request carried weight because he understood both sides of the aviation equation. "What happened to their engines?" Sarah asked, already moving toward her closet to find appropriate clothing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Unknown at this time, the crew reported severe turbulence about 15 minutes ago, then declared an emergency citing dual-engine failure. That was our last communication. The aircraft's emergency locator transmitter is active, and radar shows they're maintaining a controlled descent. But we need someone with command experience to coordinate the emergency response. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. Dual-engine failures were extraordinarily rare on modern aircraft. Bird strikes could potentially damage both engines, but the 787's engines were positioned far enough apart that simultaneous ingestion would be highly unlikely. Fuel contamination was possible, but commercial aviation's fuel quality control systems made that scenario remote. Severe weather could theoretically cause flameouts in both engines, but the 787's advanced engine control systems were designed to prevent that. "Who's the pilot in command on 892? Sarah asked, pulling on her jacket. "Captain Lisa Wang, 15 years with United, about 8,000 hours total time, including 3,200 on the 787. First Officer Robert Kim has approximately 4,500 hours with 1,800 on type. Both are current and qualified, but this situation is beyond normal emergency procedures." Sarah knew the statistics by heart. Dual-engine failures occurred roughly once every 10 million flight hours. Most pilots would never face such an emergency during their entire careers. The procedures existed in training manuals and simulation programs. But the real-world execution under extreme stress was entirely different. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Sarah said, grabbing her car keys. "But Tom, you need to understand that I have no official authority here. I can't override air traffic control decisions or give direct instructions to the flight crew." "We understand, Captain. We're not asking you to take control of the situation. We need your expertise to help coordinate our response and provide technical guidance. Captain Chen is authorized to designate you as an emergency aviation consultant." As Sarah drove toward Denver International Airport, her mind shifted into the analytical mode that had served her throughout her flying career. She began mentally reviewing everything she knew about the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. The aircraft was Boeing's newest wide-body design, featuring composite construction, advanced fly-by-wire controls, and highly efficient engines. It was designed with multiple redundancies to prevent exactly the kind of emergency now developing over the Colorado mountains. The 787's electrical systems were powered by the engines, but backup systems included a ram air turbine that would deploy automatically if both engines failed. This would provide limited electrical power and hydraulic pressure for essential flight controls and instrumentation. The aircraft's glide ratio would allow it to descend approximately 2.5 nautical miles for every 1,000 feet of altitude, giving Captain Wang and her crew precious time to troubleshoot and prepare for an emergency landing. But time was still their enemy. From 28,000 feet, even with optimal glide performance, Flight 892 would have perhaps 30 to 40 minutes before reaching an altitude where landing became inevitable. They would need to identify a suitable airport, declare their intentions to air traffic control, and execute an approach with no engine power, a scenario that pushed the limits of even the most experienced crews. Sarah's phone rang again as she merged onto the highway leading to the airport. This time, the caller ID showed her daughter Emma's number. "Mom, I just saw something on the news about a plane emergency at DEN. Are you involved?" "I'm heading to the airport to provide some technical consultation," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Nothing more than that." "But Mom, what if?" "Emma, I need you to trust me. This is what I'm trained for, and there are people who need help right now. I'll call you as soon as I can." Sarah ended the call and pressed harder on the accelerator. She understood Emma's concern. Her daughter had watched her mother's career destroyed over a matter of principle, had seen the financial and emotional toll of standing up to corporate authority. The idea of Sarah becoming involved in another high-stakes aviation emergency undoubtedly triggered fears about further complications in their already difficult lives. But Sarah also knew that some situations transcended personal considerations. Somewhere above the Rocky Mountains, Captain Wang was facing decisions that would determine whether 200 people returned safely to their families or became another tragic statistic in aviation history. If Sarah's experience and knowledge could contribute to a successful outcome, she had a moral obligation to help. As she approached the airport, Sarah could see the emergency vehicles already positioning themselves near the runways. Fire trucks, ambulances, and specialized rescue equipment were deploying according to well-rehearsed protocols. The airport's Emergency Operations Center would be coordinating with multiple agencies, FAA controllers, airline operations centers, medical facilities, and law enforcement. Sarah parked in the designated area and hurried toward the air traffic control tower. Security personnel, already briefed on her arrival, escorted her quickly through normally restricted areas. As she climbed the stairs toward the control center, she could hear the controlled urgency in radio communications echoing through the corridors. United 892, Denver approach, radio check. Silence. United 892, if you can hear this transmission, squawk 7700 and maintain a present heading. Still silent. The lack of communication from Flight 892 added another layer of complexity to an already desperate situation. Without radio contact, air traffic controllers couldn't provide navigation assistance, runway information, or coordination with emergency services. Captain Wang and her crew were essentially flying blind, relying solely on their instruments and training to navigate an emergency that would challenge the most experienced pilots in the industry. As Sarah reached the control tower, she took a deep breath and prepared to re-enter the world of commercial aviation emergency response. She had no way of knowing that the crisis developing above the Colorado Rockies would test not only her technical knowledge, but also her ability to navigate the complex dynamics between regulatory authority, airline politics, and the fundamental responsibility to protect innocent lives. The emergency was just beginning. The Denver Approach Control Center buzzed with controlled chaos as Sarah entered the facility. Multiple controllers sat at their radar stations, their voices calm but urgent as they coordinated with aircraft throughout Colorado airspace. Large displays showed weather patterns, flight tracks, and emergency response protocols. In the center of it all stood Captain David Chen, now wearing a supervisor's headset, his eyes fixed on a single blip moving steadily southeast across the screen. "Sarah, thank God you're here," Chen said, extending his hand. "We've got updates, and none of them are good." Chen led her to a dedicated emergency coordination station where multiple screens displayed real-time information about Flight 892. The aircraft's transponder showed it descending through 19,000 feet at approximately 1,800 feet per minute, a controlled rate that suggested the crew still had some control over the aircraft's descent profile. We regained brief radio contact about 8 minutes ago, Chen explained. Captain Wang transmitted for maybe 30 seconds before we lost them again. She confirmed dual engine failure, reported they're running on battery power only, and indicated they're attempting to reach Colorado Springs Airport instead of Denver. Sarah studied the flight path data, her mind immediately calculating distances and descent rates. Colorado Springs is closer, but their runway length is marginal for a 787. What's the longest runway they have? Runway 17R35L is 13,500 feet long and 150 feet wide. It should be adequate for an emergency landing, but barely. The issue is terrain. They'll have to navigate through some challenging mountain passes to reach the airport, and with no engine power, they can't climb to clear higher elevations if they get off course. A new voice interrupted their conversation. "Excuse me, who authorized civilian personnel in this control center?" Sarah turned to see a man in an expensive suit approaching their station. His badge identified him as Marcus Webb, Regional Manager for United Airlines Denver Operations. Behind him walked two other individuals, a woman with FAA credentials and another man wearing the insignia of a United Airlines chief pilot. "Mr. Webb, this is Captain Sarah Mitchell," Chen said diplomatically. "She's here at my request to provide technical consultation on the emergency." Webb's expression hardened when he heard Sarah's name. "Captain Mitchell, the pilot who was terminated by Continental Airlines for insubordination? You want to involve someone with that background in a United Airlines emergency?" The FAA representative, Helen Rodriguez, stepped forward. "Mr. Webb, we appreciate United's concern, but emergency response protocols allow airport authorities to utilize any available expertise during crisis situations. Captain Mitchell's experience with wide-body aircraft could be valuable." "Valuable?" Webb's voice rose slightly. "This woman nearly cost Continental Airways millions of dollars because she refused to follow operational directives. Now you want her involved in decisions that could affect United's reputation and liability exposure?" Sarah felt the familiar surge of anger that had sustained her through months of legal battles, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Mr. Webb, I'm here to help save lives, not to debate corporate policies. If you have concerns about my involvement, you're welcome to address them with Airport Authority after we resolve this emergency." The United chief pilot, Captain Robert Sterling, had been quietly reviewing the flight data. "Mitchell, I've heard about your situation with Continental, but right now, we need to focus on getting Wang and her crew on the ground safely. What's your assessment of their options?" Sarah appreciated Sterling's direct approach. Based on their current position and descent rate, they have approximately 25 minutes before they reach minimum controllable altitude. Colorado Springs is their best option, but the approach is going to be extremely challenging. They'll need to execute a dead-stick landing with no go-around capability. "Dead-stick landing?" Rodriguez asked. "Landing with no engine power," Sarah explained. "The aircraft becomes a glider, so they get one chance at the approach. If they're too high, too fast, or misaligned with the runway, there's no opportunity to add power and try again." Chen's radio crackled with a new transmission. "Denver approach, United 892. Everyone in the room stopped talking. Chen immediately responded, "United 892, Denver approach, go ahead." Captain Wang's voice came through clearly this time, though strained with stress. "Denver approach, we're passing through 16,000 feet, heading 180, estimating Colorado Springs in approximately 18 minutes. We have intermittent electrical power from the ram air turbine, but flight controls are becoming increasingly difficult to manage." United 892, understood. Colorado Springs Airport has been cleared for your emergency approach. Runway 17R is available with emergency services standing by. Current winds are 220 degrees at 8 knots. Denver approach, we're going to need vectors for the approach. Our navigation systems are operating on backup power only, and we don't have reliable GPS guidance. Quote, Sarah stepped closer to Chen's microphone. Ask her about control authority. Can she maintain heading and altitude control accurately enough for precision approaches? Chen nodded and transmitted, United 892 Denver approach. Can you confirm your control authority for precision approach guidance? There was a pause before Wang responded. Denver approach, control inputs are becoming sluggish. We estimate we have maybe 60% normal control authority. We're also experiencing some unusual vibrations through the airframe that we can't identify. Webb immediately turned to Sterling. Unusual vibrations? That could indicate structural damage. We need to consider the possibility that this isn't just an engine failure. Something else might have caused catastrophic damage to multiple systems. Sarah's mind raced through potential scenarios. Dual engine failures accompanied by structural vibrations suggested either a severe bird strike, major turbulence encounter, or possibly even sabotage. Each possibility would affect how the crew should approach the emergency landing. United 892, Chen transmitted. Can you describe the vibrations you're experiencing? Denver approach. The vibrations seem to be coming from the aft section of the aircraft. They started about 10 minutes ago and are gradually increasing in intensity. We're also noticing that our control inputs require more force than normal. Sterling pulled out his phone and speed-dialed United's Maintenance Control Center in Chicago. This is Captain Sterling in Denver. I need an immediate assessment of potential structural issues on a 787 following dual-engine failure with reported aft vibrations and increased control force requirements. While Sterling coordinated with maintenance, Sarah studied the weather radar displays. A new concern was developing. Afternoon thunderstorms were beginning to form along the front range of the Rocky Mountains, creating additional turbulence and visibility challenges exactly where Flight 892 would need to execute their approach. Chen, look at this weather pattern, Sarah pointed to the radar display. Those storms are developing right along their approach path to Colorado Springs. In their current condition, flying through turbulence could be catastrophic. Chen immediately contacted Colorado Springs Air Traffic Control. Springs Tower, Denver approach. United 892 will be executing the emergency approach in approximately 15 minutes. We're showing developing thunderstorm activity along your approach corridors. Can you provide current conditions and recommended approach headings? The response was not encouraging. Denver approach, Springs Tower. We're observing moderate turbulence reports from aircraft in the area, with scattered rain showers and visibility dropping to 3 miles in precipitation. Recommend your emergency aircraft consider alternate approach vectors from the east to avoid the worst weather. But an eastern approach would require Flight 892 to fly an additional 10 miles, potentially putting them beyond their gliding range. Sarah quickly calculated the mathematics. From their current altitude and position, they had exactly enough energy to reach Colorado Springs via the most direct route. Any deviation might leave them short of the runway. Webb had been monitoring the radio communications, and his frustration was becoming evident. This is exactly what I was concerned about. We've got an emergency situation that requires split-second decisions from qualified United personnel, not input from someone with a history of challenging operational authority. Helen Rodriguez stepped between Webb and Sarah. Mr. Webb, I need to remind you that federal aviation regulations give emergency response coordinators broad authority to utilize available expertise during crisis situations. Captain Mitchell's involvement has been properly authorized. Authorized by whom? Webb demanded. I represent United Airlines' interests in this matter, and I'm telling you that involving this woman creates liability issues that could... Mr. Webb, Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through the argument. There are 200 people on that airplane who don't care about corporate liability. They care about getting home to their families. If you want to debate my qualifications, we can do that after we get them on the ground safely. Sterling ended his call with maintenance and rejoined the group. Maintenance says the vibration pattern is consistent with possible cargo shift or structural damage to the aft pressure bulkhead. Either scenario could affect flight control response and make the landing even more challenging. The radio crackled again. Denver approach, United 892. We're passing through 12,000 feet and are beginning to encounter moderate turbulence. Request immediate vectors to Colorado Springs for emergency approach. Chen looked at Sarah. Decision time. Do we vector them through the weather to maintain their energy for landing, or try to route them around and risk coming up short? Sarah stared at the radar display, weighing options that could mean the difference between life and death for 200 innocent people. Every choice carried enormous risk, and the margin for error was disappearing with each passing minute. United 892 is passing through 10,000 feet, Chen announced, his voice tight with urgency. At their current descent rate, we have maybe 12 minutes before they reach minimum approach altitude. Sarah grabbed a calculator and began working through the energy management equations that would determine Flight 892's fate. Altitude was currency in aviation. Every 1,000 feet of height could be converted into distance or time, but once spent, it couldn't be recovered without engine power. The mathematics were unforgiving. They're currently 34 nautical miles from Colorado Springs, she announced. In ideal conditions, they need to lose about 8,000 more feet to reach pattern altitude. That gives them a glide ratio that works, but barely. Webb had been coordinating frantically with United's crisis management team in Chicago. He turned back to the group with new information that changed everything. I just spoke with our dispatch center. Flight 892 was carrying an unusual cargo load today. They have 12,000 pounds of medical equipment destined for a hospital in Denver. The cargo was loaded in the aft compartment to balance passenger weight distribution, but if it shifted during the turbulence, it could explain both the vibrations and the control issues. Sterling immediately understood the implications. Shifted cargo changes the aircraft's center of gravity. If the weight moved too far aft, the nose-heavy trim could make the airplane almost unflyable. Wang might be fighting just to keep the aircraft from entering an unrecoverable dive. Sarah's mind raced through the aerodynamics involved. An aft center of gravity would make the aircraft longitudinally unstable, requiring constant forward pressure on the controls to prevent the nose from pitching up into a stall. Without engine power to provide additional control authority, Captain Wang would be performing a delicate balancing act between maintaining airspeed and controlling altitude. The radio interrupted their analysis. Denver approach, United 892, we're encountering severe control difficulties. The aircraft wants to pitch nose up, and we're having to use significant forward pressure to maintain altitude. We're also experiencing what feels like Dutch roll oscillations. Dutch roll was a combined yawing and rolling motion that could indicate either aerodynamic instability or structural damage. In either case, it meant Flight 892 was becoming increasingly difficult to control as they approached the most critical phase of their emergency. United 892, Chen transmitted. We're showing you approximately 11 minutes from Colorado Springs. Are you able to maintain controlled flight for approach? Denver approach. We're managing, but this is taking everything we have. We need immediate vectors and altitude guidance. We can't afford any course deviations. Helen Rodriguez had been monitoring FAA emergency protocols on her tablet. Chen, I need to inform you that FAA emergency procedures require us to offer the crew a choice of available airports. There's still time to vector them to Denver International, which has longer runways and better emergency services. Negative, Sarah said immediately. Look at their energy state. Vectoring to Denver would require them to fly an additional 22 nautical miles. They don't have the altitude to make that distance. Webb stepped forward aggressively. Mitchell, you're not in command here. Denver International is United's primary hub. We have full maintenance facilities, specialized emergency equipment, and our own medical staff. It's the logical choice for our aircraft. Your aircraft is a glider with 200 people on board, Sarah shot back. Logic doesn't change physics. They don't have the energy to reach Denver. Sterling was studying approach charts for both airports. Mitchell's right about the distance, but Webb has a point about emergency services. Colorado Springs has a shorter runway and limited rescue capabilities compared to Denver. Chen faced an impossible decision. As the emergency coordinator, he had the authority to recommend approach vectors, but the final choice belonged to Captain Wang. However, she was dealing with an aircraft that was becoming increasingly unstable and might not have the luxury of evaluating multiple options. United 892, Chen transmitted carefully. We can vector you to either Colorado Springs at your current energy state, or Denver International if you believe you have sufficient altitude. What are your intentions? Quote. Captain Wang's response revealed the desperation of their situation. Denver approach. We're losing control authority rapidly. These oscillations are getting worse, and we're having to use both pilots on the controls to maintain level flight. We need the closest available runway. United 892, that would be Colorado Springs, bearing 180 degrees 28 nautical miles. Roger, Denver approach. We're committing to Colorado Springs. The word committing carried enormous weight in aviation. It meant Flight 892 was burning their bridges. They no longer had the energy to reach any alternate airport. Whatever happened next would happen at Colorado Springs Municipal Airport. Webb immediately got on his phone with United's legal department. The decision to land at a non-hub airport with limited emergency services would have significant liability implications if the outcome was unfavorable. Sarah could hear him explaining that the choice had been made against United's recommendations. Meanwhile, Sterling was coordinating with Colorado Springs Emergency Services. Springs Tower, United Chief Pilot Sterling in Denver. Our 892 Heavy will be landing emergency in approximately 8 minutes. We need every piece of firefighting and rescue equipment you have positioned along the runway. United Springs Tower. We've got 6 fire trucks, 4 ambulances, and 2 rescue helicopters standing by. The runway has been cleared, and we've declared the airport closed to all other traffic. Sarah studied the latest weather radar images, and what she saw made her stomach clench. The afternoon thunderstorms were intensifying exactly where Flight 892 would need to execute their final approach. Rain, turbulence, and wind shear were converging at the worst possible moment. Chen, they're going to be flying directly into that storm cell during their approach. In their current condition, even moderate turbulence could cause them to lose control completely. Chen immediately contacted Colorado Springs. Springs Tower, Denver approach. What are your current surface conditions? Denver approach. Winds are now 240 degrees at 15 knots, gusting to 28. We have moderate rain showers with visibility 3 miles and decreasing. We're also getting reports of wind shear on final approach to runway 17R. Wind shear, sudden changes in wind speed and direction, was among the most dangerous conditions for aircraft, especially during approach and landing. For an airplane with no engine power and compromised control authority, flying through wind shear could be catastrophic. Sarah grabbed Chen's microphone. Springs Tower, this is Captain Mitchell coordinating emergency response. Can you give us any alternate approach options that avoid the worst weather? Captain, negative. The storm system extends across our entire approach corridor. Your aircraft will have to penetrate the weather regardless of approach direction. Webb immediately protested Sarah's radio transmission. Mitchell has no authority to communicate with air traffic control in this situation. She's not even employed by an airline. Helen Rodriguez intervened. Mr. Webb, Captain Mitchell is operating under emergency consultation authority. Her communications are appropriate and necessary. The tension in the control room was reaching a breaking point, but it was nothing compared to what Captain Wang and her crew were experiencing at 6,000 feet above the Colorado mountains. The aircraft was becoming increasingly unstable, weather conditions were deteriorating, and they were running out of both altitude and options. United 892 Denver approach. You're 8 miles from Colorado Springs. Turn left heading 160 degrees for final approach to runway 17R. Contact Springs Tower on 118.6. Denver approach, United 892, turning left 160 degrees, switching to Springs Tower. Thanks for your help. As Flight 892 disappeared from Denver's radar coverage, transferring to Colorado Springs approach control, Sarah realized that everything they had worked for in the past hour was now beyond their influence. Captain Wang and her crew were alone with their crippled aircraft flying into a storm, with one chance to get 200 people safely on the ground. The point of no return had passed. Whatever happened next would be determined by skill, luck, and the unforgiving laws of physics that governed powered flight. In the control room, all they could do was monitor emergency frequencies and hope that Wang's expertise would be enough to overcome the impossible odds stacked against Flight 892. Time was running out, and the most dangerous part of their ordeal was just beginning. At Colorado Springs Municipal Airport, the control tower had become a nerve center of coordinated emergency response. Tower controller Jessica Martinez watched her radar screen as United 892 appeared at the edge of her airspace, a single blip representing 200 lives descending through increasingly turbulent skies. United 892, Colorado Springs Tower, radar contact 5 miles northeast, altitude 4,200 feet. You're cleared for emergency approach runway 17R, winds 240 degrees at 18 knots, gusting to 32. Visibility for 2 miles in moderate rain. Captain Wang's voice came through clearly despite the challenging conditions. Springs Tower, United 892. We have the airport in sight intermittently through the rain. We are experiencing severe control difficulties and will need continuous guidance on this approach. In Denver, Sarah and the emergency coordination team had patched into Colorado Springs Tower frequency to monitor the final approach. The radio communications would be their only window into what was happening during the most critical minutes of the emergency. "She's too high," Sarah muttered, studying the radar display that showed Flight 892's position relative to a normal glide path. At that altitude and distance, she's going to have to lose altitude quickly, but without engines, she can't afford to get slow. Webb had been monitoring United's company frequency, coordinating with their crisis management team. Our flight operations center is tracking this in real time. If this goes wrong, United could face hundreds of millions in liability claims, not to mention the regulatory investigations. Mr. Webb, Helen Rodriguez said firmly, perhaps you could focus your energy on supporting the emergency response rather than calculating litigation expenses. Sterling was studying approach charts and weather data simultaneously. The wind conditions are the biggest problem now. With gusts up to 32 knots and the wind nearly perpendicular to the runway, Wang is going to have to execute a crosswind landing with no power and compromised controls. That's pushing the limits of what's physically possible. Sarah grabbed a phone and dialed Colorado Springs Tower directly. This is Captain Mitchell coordinating the Denver emergency response. Can you patch me through to talk directly with United 892? Captain Mitchell, this is Tower Supervisor Garcia. We can set up a coordination frequency if you think it would help. Yes, do it. Wang might need technical guidance that only someone with heavy aircraft experience can provide. Webb immediately objected. Absolutely not. Mitchell has no authority to communicate with our aircraft. This could create massive liability issues if her advice contributes to an accident. Your aircraft is about to crash, Sarah said bluntly. Liability is irrelevant if everyone dies. I'm trying to prevent that. Rodriguez stepped between them again. Mr. Webb, emergency protocols supersede normal operational procedures. Captain Mitchell's consultation is within regulatory guidelines. Garcia's voice came through the speakers. United 892, Colorado Springs Tower. We have Captain Mitchell from Denver Emergency Coordination, available on frequency 121.9 if you need additional technical consultation. There was a brief pause before Wang responded. Tower, we'll take any help we can get. We're switching to 121.9. Sarah moved to a dedicated radio station. United 892, this is Captain Sarah Mitchell. I've been coordinating your emergency response from Denver. What's your current status? Captain Mitchell, this is Captain Wang. We're on final approach, but the aircraft is extremely difficult to control. The nose wants to pitch up constantly, and we're getting severe buffeting from the shifted cargo. We're also flying through moderate turbulence and rain. Sarah's mind immediately shifted into instructor mode, the same analytical approach she used with student pilots, but compressed into seconds rather than hours. Captain Wang, describe your current configuration and control inputs. We have gear down, flaps at 30 degrees, and we're maintaining about 160 knots. Both Kim and I are on the controls, applying constant forward pressure to keep the nose down. Sarah quickly calculated the energy state. With gear and flaps extended, Flight 892 was in high drag configuration, bleeding airspeed rapidly. But the configuration was necessary for landing. They couldn't retract anything without risking an inability to slow down for touchdown. Wang, you're flying the aircraft correctly. That forward pressure is keeping you alive. Don't try to trim it out. The shifted cargo means normal trim settings won't work. Understood. Captain Mitchell, we're having trouble maintaining the center line. The crosswind is pushing us left, but when we correct with the right rudder, the nose yaws dramatically. This was exactly what Sarah had feared. The compromised control authority meant normal crosswind correction techniques wouldn't work effectively. Wang would need to use a modified approach technique designed for severely degraded aircraft. Wang, listen carefully. Instead of trying to maintain centerline continuously, fly a slightly curved approach. Start your approach left of centerline, then gradually correct right as you descend. This will minimize the control inputs required and reduce the oscillations. In Colorado Springs Tower, Garcia was coordinating the emergency vehicles. All units, United 892 is on final approach, approximately 2 miles out. Aircraft are experiencing control difficulties and may not be able to maintain a normal approach path. The fire chief responded immediately. Tower, we have foam trucks positioned every 500 feet along the runway. If they land hard or go off the runway, we'll be in position to respond immediately. On the emergency frequency, Wang's voice carried increasing strain. Captain Mitchell, we're encountering severe turbulence now. The aircraft is pitching and rolling unpredictably. We're having trouble maintaining attitude control. Sarah knew that Flight 892 was flying directly through the heart of the thunderstorm cell. In a powered aircraft, pilots could add thrust to maintain control authority during turbulence. Without engines, Wang was entirely dependent on airspeed management and control surface effectiveness. Wang, reduce your angle of attack slightly. Trade some altitude for airspeed to give yourself more control authority. The runway is long enough that you can afford to come in a little fast. Roger, reducing angle of attack. Sterling had been monitoring radar data from Denver. Sarah, they're descending through the worst part of the storm now. Radar shows heavy precipitation and wind shear right at their altitude. Suddenly, Wang's voice came through with obvious distress. Mitchell, we just hit severe turbulence. The aircraft rolled about 45 degrees left, and we've lost significant altitude. We're now below the normal glide path. Being below the glide path was dangerous. It meant the aircraft might not clear obstacles before the runway or might touch down short of the paved surface. But in their current situation, it also meant they were committed to landing regardless of their position. Wang, don't try to climb back to the glide path. You don't have the energy. Focus on maintaining your approach speed and getting the aircraft stabilized. The runway approach is clear of obstacles. Quote, United 892, Colorado Springs Tower, Garcia transmitted. You appear to be slightly left of centerline and below the glide path. Runway 17R is 13,500 feet long. You have plenty of landing distance available. Tower, we see the runway. We're going to be landing hard and fast, but we think we can get it on the ground. In the Denver Control Center, everyone was silent, listening to the radio communications that would determine whether Flight 892 became a miracle survival story or a tragic accident. Webb had stopped calculating liability exposure and was simply listening like everyone else. Even corporate considerations became irrelevant when human lives hung in the balance. Captain Mitchell, Wang's voice came through one final time. We're committed now. We can see the runway threshold. Thank you for your help. You've got this, Wang. Trust your training and get those people home. Sarah stepped back from the radio, her hands shaking slightly. There was nothing more she could do. Captain Wang and First Officer Kim were now alone in their crippled Boeing 787, fighting against shifted cargo, crosswinds, turbulence, and the fundamental challenge of landing a powerless aircraft in conditions that would challenge even the most experienced crews. The next few minutes would determine whether her decision to get involved in Flight 892's emergency had helped save 200 lives, or whether she would carry the weight of another aviation tragedy for the rest of her life. Outside, the storm continued to build over the Colorado mountains. But inside the control centers, all anyone could do was wait and listen for the outcome that would define this day for everyone involved. The final 30 seconds of Flight 892's approach unfolded in what seemed like slow motion for everyone monitoring the emergency frequencies. In Colorado Springs Tower, Controller Martinez watched through binoculars as the Boeing 787 emerged from the rain clouds, its massive silhouette appearing lower and faster than any normal approach she had ever witnessed. United 892 is visible on final, Martinez announced over the emergency frequency. Aircraft appears stable but significantly below normal glide path and approaching at high speed. Through the tower windows, emergency responders could see the 787's landing lights cutting through the rain and darkness. The aircraft was indeed fast, probably approaching at nearly 180 knots compared to the normal landing speed of 150 knots. But Captain Wang had no choice. Without engine power, she needed that extra airspeed to maintain control authority all the way to touchdown. In the cabin of Flight 892, passengers gripped their armrests as they felt the aircraft buffeting through the turbulent air. Flight attendant Maria Santos had managed to prepare the cabin as best she could under the circumstances, ensuring passengers were in brace positions and emergency exits were identified. But nothing could have prepared the 184 passengers for the violence of the approach they were experiencing. 30 seconds to touchdown, First Officer Kim called out in the cockpit, his voice strained from the physical effort of maintaining control. I can see the runway, Captain Wang replied, wrestling with the control yoke that required both pilots' strength to keep the aircraft aligned. We're going to hit hard, but we're going to make it. The shifted medical cargo in the aft compartment continued to create an unnatural center of gravity that fought against every control input. Wang had to maintain constant forward pressure to prevent the nose from pitching up into a stall, while simultaneously applying right rudder to counteract the crosswind that was pushing them toward the left side of the runway. Through the rain-streaked windscreen, the runway threshold lights appeared larger and larger. Wang made the critical decision that would determine whether 200 people survived the next 10 seconds. "I'm going to plant it on the numbers," she announced to Kim. "We can't afford to float or try for a gentle touchdown. We need to get this airplane on the ground now." At Colorado Springs Airport, Fire Chief Robert Martinez watched through the storm as the 787 descended toward the runway threshold. Even from his position 2,000 feet down the runway, he could see that the aircraft was approaching faster and at a steeper angle than normal. His crews were positioned every 500 feet along the 13,500-foot runway, ready to respond within seconds if the landing went wrong. "All units, aircraft is on final approach. Prepare for possible runway overrun or hard landing scenario," Martinez radioed to his emergency teams. In Denver, Sarah stood frozen at the radio console, listening to the final seconds of an emergency that had consumed the last 4 hours of her life. Every instinct she had developed over 12,000 hours of flying told her that Wang was executing the approach correctly, but she also knew that the margin for error had disappeared completely. 20 seconds, Kim's voice came through the speakers. "Runway in sight, centerline acquired," Wang responded. The 787's main landing gear touched the runway at exactly 184 knots, 34 knots faster than normal, with a descent rate that sent shockwaves through the aircraft structure. The impact was so violent that it could be felt in the control tower 300 feet away from the runway. But the gear held. Boeing's engineers had designed the landing system to withstand impact forces far beyond normal operations, and that design margin meant the difference between survival and catastrophe for Flight 892. Wang immediately applied maximum braking, but without engine reverse thrust, stopping the massive aircraft would depend entirely on wheel brakes and aerodynamic drag. The 787 thundered down the runway, throwing up huge sprays of water as its tires fought for traction on the rain-soaked pavement. "Brakes applied, we're on the ground," Wang's voice carried a mixture of relief and continuing urgency. "We're not going to stop before the end of the runway." Colorado Springs Runway 17R was 13,500 feet long, among the longest runways in Colorado, but Flight 892 had touched down at the 1,000-foot marker and was carrying far too much energy to stop within the remaining distance. At their current deceleration rate, they would overrun the paved surface by at least 1,500 feet. "Emergency vehicles, aircraft are going to overrun the south end of the runway," Martinez announced. "Position for overrun response." The 787 continued its high-speed roll down the runway, its brakes glowing red-hot from the extreme energy they were trying to dissipate. At 80 knots, still far too fast to stop in time, the aircraft passed the final runway distance marker and continued onto the 600-foot safety area beyond the pavement. Wang fought to keep the aircraft straight as the landing gear transitioned from smooth pavement to rough grass and gravel. The nose gear began to shimmy violently, and the aircraft started to veer left toward a drainage ditch that paralleled the runway. "Kim, help me with the rudder!" Wang shouted. "Don't let it go left!" Both pilots applied full right rudder pressure, their legs straining against the pedals as they fought to keep the 787 from ground looping into the ditch. The aircraft's speed continued to bleed off as it plowed through the soggy ground beyond the runway, creating massive furrows in the earth. At 40 knots, still moving fast enough to cause serious injury if they hit an obstacle, the 787's nose gear caught in a particularly soft section of ground. The gear strut compressed dramatically, and for a moment it looked like the aircraft might nose over. But the main gear remained firmly planted, and the forward momentum finally began to dissipate rapidly. United Flight 892 came to rest 1,800 feet beyond the end of runway 17R, upright and intact, sitting in a Colorado pasture with its nose gear buried nearly to the axle in soft earth. Steam rose from the overheated brakes and the rain-soaked engines, but there was no fire, no structural collapse, and no apparent injuries to the 200 people on board. For several seconds, the only sound audible on the emergency frequencies was the distant rumble of thunder from the passing storm. Then Captain Wang's voice came through, calm and professional despite everything they had just experienced. Colorado Springs Tower United 892 is stopped approximately 1,800 feet south of the runway. All passengers and crew appear to be uninjured. We'll need ground support to evacuate the aircraft. In Denver, Sarah sank into a chair, the emotional weight of the last 4 hours finally hitting her. Around her, the control center erupted in subdued cheers and expressions of relief. Even Webb, who had opposed her involvement from the beginning, was nodding with apparent respect. "Outstanding work, Mitchell," Sterling said, extending his hand. "Your guidance during that approach probably made the difference between a successful landing and a disaster." Helen Rodriguez was already coordinating with FAA investigators who would need to examine every aspect of the emergency response. "Captain Mitchell, we're going to need a complete debrief of your technical recommendations and decision-making process. This emergency will become a case study for future training programs." At Colorado Springs Airport, emergency vehicles surrounded the Boeing 787, their crews working to establish safe evacuation procedures for the 200 passengers and crew. The aircraft was structurally sound but would require significant recovery efforts to extract it from the muddy field where it had come to rest. Captain Wang and First Officer Kim had successfully executed one of the most challenging emergency landings in commercial aviation history. They had taken a powerless aircraft through severe weather, managed critical control problems caused by shifted cargo, and brought everyone home alive despite facing conditions that would have challenged the most experienced test pilots. But as Sarah sat in the Denver Control Center, she realized that Flight 892's emergency had accomplished something else entirely. For the first time in 18 months, she had been able to use her expertise to protect innocent lives, rather than fight corporate bureaucracy. The technical knowledge and decision-making skills that had cost her career at Continental Airways had just saved 200 people from what could have been a catastrophic accident. The radio crackled one final time with a transmission from Colorado Springs. "All stations, United 892 emergency is concluded. All passengers and crew have been safely evacuated, no injuries reported." The emergency was over, but its impact on everyone involved was just beginning to unfold. 3 days after Flight 892's emergency landing, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID showed a Washington, D.C. area code, and the voice on the other end introduced himself as Jonathan Reynolds, Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration. "Captain Mitchell, I'm calling personally to express the FAA's gratitude for your role in the successful resolution of the United Airlines emergency. Your technical expertise and decision-making under pressure exemplified the highest standards of aviation safety." Sarah was stunned. The FAA administrator was calling her directly, something that rarely happened to individual pilots, and certainly not to someone who had been effectively blacklisted from the airline industry. "Administrator Reynolds, I appreciate the recognition, but I was just doing what any experienced pilot would do in that situation." "Captain Mitchell, that's precisely the point. Not every pilot would have had the technical knowledge to guide Captain Wang through such a complex emergency approach. More importantly, not every pilot would have put aside personal considerations to help save lives after facing the professional challenges you've experienced." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, covering the technical aspects of Flight 892's emergency and the broader implications for aviation safety. Reynolds explained that the FAA was launching a comprehensive review of emergency response protocols, using Flight 892 as a case study for improving coordination between air traffic control, airline operations, and technical experts during crisis situations. "We're particularly interested in formalizing the role of technical consultants during emergencies," Reynolds explained. "Your involvement demonstrated the value of having experienced pilots available to provide guidance even when they're not directly involved in flight operations." Sarah learned that Captain Wang and First Officer Kim had specifically requested that she be recognized for her contribution to their successful emergency landing. Both pilots had submitted detailed reports describing how her technical guidance had been crucial during the final approach phase. The investigation into Flight 892's dual-engine failure revealed a scenario that aviation experts had considered theoretically possible, but had never actually occurred in commercial operations. The aircraft had encountered a rare weather phenomenon called a microburst, a powerful downdraft that had created wind speeds exceeding 80 knots in a localized area just 200 feet in diameter. The microburst had occurred at exactly the wrong moment, when Flight 892 was flying at 39,000 feet over a mountainous region of Colorado. The sudden downdraft had caused both engines to experience compressor stalls simultaneously, leading to flameouts that the crew couldn't recover from, despite following all standard procedures. Dr. Angela Thompson, the National Transportation Safety Board's lead investigator, explained the sequence of events during a press conference held 1 week after the emergency. This was an extremely rare meteorological event that created conditions beyond the design parameters of modern jet engines. The crew's response was textbook perfect, but they were dealing with a situation that no simulation or training program had ever prepared them for. The investigation also revealed that the medical equipment in the aft cargo compartment had indeed shifted during the severe turbulence caused by the microburst. The 12,000 pounds of sensitive hospital machinery had broken free from its securing straps and moved nearly 6 feet aft, creating the center of gravity problems that made the aircraft so difficult to control. Boeing issued a service bulletin recommending enhanced cargo securing procedures for medical equipment and other heavy items that could shift during extreme turbulence. The bulletin became mandatory within 6 months, affecting cargo loading procedures for airlines worldwide. But the most significant outcome of Flight 892's emergency wasn't technical, it was human. Captain Wang and First Officer Kim became advocates for recognizing the expertise of pilots who had been marginalized by airline politics or corporate conflicts. During a pilots' union meeting in Chicago, Captain Wang addressed an audience of 500 commercial pilots. Sarah Mitchell saved 200 lives, including mine, because she put safety above personal considerations. She could have stayed home and avoided any risk to her reputation, but she chose to help when we needed it most. That's the kind of pilot I want backing me up during an emergency. The speech, recorded and shared widely on social media, began to change perceptions within the aviation community about pilots who had challenged corporate authority. Rather than being viewed as troublemakers, they began to be recognized as professionals who prioritized safety over convenience. 3 months after the emergency, Sarah received another unexpected call. This time, it was from Patricia Williams, Chief Executive Officer of Frontier Airlines. Williams explained that Frontier was launching a new safety initiative and wanted Sarah to lead their flight operations safety department. Captain Mitchell, we've been following your career and your role in the United Emergency. Frontier needs leaders who understand that safety isn't negotiable, even when it conflicts with operational pressures. We want someone who won't compromise principles for profit margins. The offer was extraordinary, not just because it represented a return to commercial aviation, but because it was a leadership position that would allow Sarah to influence safety culture across an entire airline. The salary was comparable to what she had earned as a captain, and the position included authority to ground aircraft or suspend operations if safety concerns arose. Sarah's acceptance of the Frontier position marked the beginning of a new chapter in her career, but it also represented something larger. Her willingness to sacrifice her career for safety principles had ultimately led to a role where she could have an even greater impact on aviation safety. Within her first year at Frontier, Sarah implemented several innovations that became industry standards. She established a confidential reporting system that allowed pilots to raise safety concerns without fear of retaliation. She created cross-training programs that exposed pilots to emergency scenarios beyond their normal operating experience. Most importantly, she developed protocols for utilizing experienced pilots as technical consultants during emergencies, regardless of their current employment status. The Mitchell Protocol, as it became known in aviation circles, was adopted by the FAA and incorporated into emergency response procedures at airports nationwide. The protocol established clear authority for emergency coordinators to contact qualified pilots for technical consultation, regardless of airline affiliations or employment status. Captain David Chen, who had initiated Sarah's involvement in Flight 892's emergency, was promoted to Regional Air Traffic Control Manager and became a strong advocate for the new protocols. The Mitchell Protocol recognizes that expertise doesn't disappear when someone leaves an airline. During emergencies, we need the best minds available, not just the ones who happen to be on duty. Sarah's daughter, Emma, who had watched her mother's career struggles with a mixture of pride and concern, graduated from community college with honors and enrolled in a 4-year aerospace engineering program. The financial pressures that had forced Emma to alter her educational plans had eased with Sarah's new position, but more importantly, Emma had been inspired by her mother's example. "My mom showed me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it," Emma said during her high school graduation speech. She lost her job because she wouldn't compromise safety, and that decision eventually saved 200 lives. That's the kind of person I want to be. The ripple effects of Flight 892's emergency continued to spread throughout the aviation industry. Captain Wang was promoted to chief pilot for United's Denver operations, and she used that position to advocate for improved emergency training programs. First Officer Kim became a simulator instructor, specializing in teaching emergency procedures to new pilots. Marcus Webb, the United Airlines executive who had opposed Sarah's involvement in the emergency, quietly left the airline 6 months later. His replacement, Jennifer Martinez, implemented new policies that prioritized safety expertise over corporate loyalty during emergency situations. The success of Flight 892's emergency landing also led to technological improvements in aircraft design. Boeing developed enhanced cargo restraint systems that prevented shifting during extreme turbulence. Engine manufacturers improved compressor designs to better handle microburst conditions. Air traffic control systems were upgraded to provide better weather detection and pilot warnings. But perhaps the most important legacy of Flight 892 was cultural. The aviation industry began to recognize that safety professionals who challenged corporate authority weren't troublemakers. They were essential guardians of public safety. Pilots who raised concerns about unsafe conditions were increasingly viewed as heroes rather than problems. Dr. Robert Chen, a professor of aviation safety at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, incorporated Flight 892 into his curriculum as an example of how individual courage can drive systemic safety improvements. Captain Mitchell's story demonstrates that one person's willingness to stand up for principles can ultimately save hundreds or thousands of lives. That's the kind of safety culture we need throughout aviation. 5 years after Flight 892's emergency, Sarah was invited to speak at the International Aviation Safety Conference in Montreal. Her presentation, titled "When Principles Meet Crisis: Leadership Lessons from Emergency Response," was attended by more than 2,000 aviation professionals from around the world. The question isn't whether you'll face a situation where safety conflicts with other priorities, Sarah told the audience. The question is whether you'll have the courage to choose safety when that moment comes. Every decision we make either strengthens or weakens the culture of safety that protects millions of passengers every day. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, but for Sarah, the real validation came in the emails and messages she received from pilots around the world who had faced similar ethical dilemmas. Many credited her example with giving them the courage to prioritize safety over career concerns. Sarah's story became required reading at pilot training schools throughout North America and Europe. The case study was used to teach student pilots about the broader responsibilities of aviation professionals and the importance of maintaining safety standards even under extreme pressure. Today, Sarah continues to lead Frontier Airlines' safety department, but her influence extends far beyond a single airline. She serves on FAA advisory committees, consults with aircraft manufacturers on safety design issues, and mentors young pilots who face ethical challenges in their careers. The Boeing 787 that became Flight 892 was eventually repaired and returned to service, bearing a small plaque in the cockpit that reads, "In recognition of the crew and ground support personnel who demonstrated that expertise, courage, and cooperation can overcome any emergency." But for Sarah Mitchell, the real monument to Flight 892's legacy isn't a plaque or an award. It's the knowledge that 200 people went home to their families because she chose to help when help was needed most. Her decision to sacrifice her career for safety principles had ultimately led to a role where she could protect countless more lives. The woman who was banned from flying had become one of aviation's most influential safety advocates, proving that sometimes losing everything is the first step toward finding your true purpose. Flight 892's emergency lasted only 4 hours, but its impact on aviation safety will continue for generations. In an industry where the difference between life and death often comes down to split-second decisions, Sarah Mitchell's story serves as a reminder that the most important choice any pilot will ever make isn't about throttle settings or navigation. It's about having the courage to do what's right, regardless of the personal cost. That lesson, learned in the crucible of an impossible emergency, continues to save lives every day. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.